Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. And this month, Densoro has chosen what I'm going to call basically a discussion for more creative balancing in build systems. Densoro has a bit of a thesis in this Parley, basically amounting to the idea that balancing a stat that just increases your damage is inherently challenging, and maybe there's something inherently more balanced by giving the player a lot of other power through different kinds of stats like mobility or letting them balance the difficulty instead of their own power, stuff like that. So there's a very long Parley chunk with a lot of good examples, so I'm going to read it. That'll be a long intro, and then I'll give my thoughts. Densoro says, "Happy Spoopy Sperry Spelican, Captain. Hope the cool weather's been visiting you. It sure has. Thank you. Hope you're having a good, for me it's fall, autumn as well. In September's Crew Parley, Tahitsu brought up a really interesting question about scaling difficulty in buildcraft games, and I wanted to explore that further. I mentioned, how Faker and Order places a capacity limit on your entire team, so that you can't run 5-star SSRs, the rarest, like I guess in some ways most powerful characters, in every slot. Yes, that example was to demonstrate how there can be given a cost to using a more powerful character, such that it's not that the more powerful characters aren't more powerful, but you still need to deploy them judiciously, and a clever combination of less powerful elements can stand up to maybe a more powerful element. I think that that method of sort of rating, giving each of the items in a game a score, if something is really powerful, is a really interesting and less direct way of balancing. Again, the topic of this Parley, in my mind, is kind of other ways to balance that are maybe more effective than just trying to meter the player's power level in some way. More creative approaches to balancing. So that's a fantastic example, yes. I've got a lot of faith in the idea of making the player just pay a cost to use something stronger rather than making everything a similar power level. I just want to pause here quickly before we continue though. A lot of people really misconstrue the idea of balance in games in general as being about making everything weak. Power is relative, and so as long as things are at a similar level and that level feels powerful, you know, things should generally feel very strong. And I would like to mention, I'm not sure it will come up later in this Parley, that I'm quite suspicious of the claim or the assumption a lot of games make that you need to have weaker things or there's no perspective for the stronger things. I'm not sure I feel like that's true. I feel like if the game gives you weapons at a power level that feels powerful, they won't just not feel powerful. So for example, in Warframe, if you only use weapons that do a lot of damage and kill enemies very quickly, they don't not feel powerful because they kill all the enemies. I don't have to use a weak gun for them to kill all the enemies, and that seems powerful. It already seems powerful. It's not that simple, of course, but I do think the suggestion that there have to be weaker things so there can be stronger feeling things, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But this is certainly one way to do it. Again, I think that really interrogating different ways to balance and different assumptions about balance is the topic of this Parley. So that's my intro. Back to Densoro. Kid Icarus Uprising had an interesting inversion of this capacity limit. The game's multiplayer modes aren't scored by kill count but point count. The higher a weapon's damage and perks, the more points its wielder's head is worth. Someone might have a weapon 8 times as strong as yours and easily kill you 5 times in a row, but if you can take them out 1 time despite the discrepancy, you end up ahead. That's badass. Because the match will end at a certain point threshold, this elegantly gives low-power players more lives for Zerg tactics, while turning high-power players into devastating priority targets. Again, that's so badass. I've got to check that out. This is fascinating push and pull with the game's more traditional story mode, where the goal is simply to stay alive and kill all priority targets. A difficulty is tied to in-game currency that you wager, and each time you continue after defeat, some of your wager is lost, resulting in an easier retry but worse rewards. Again, very interesting. Like, that sounds awesome. I'm definitely playing that. Alternatively, God Hand, lots of examples in this Parley, by the way, has an adaptive difficulty system similar to a style meter. If you're not familiar, this is in games like Devil May Cry is a popular one, Bayonetta, where basically the more flamboyant your combo, the more score you get. And the idea is to whoop your enemies in this stylish, cool-looking way, not to merely dispatch them. The longer you terrorize enemies in God Hand as well, without getting hit, the more durable, aggressive, responsive, and plentiful enemies become. If this high level starts to kick your ass but does not kill you, the game will simmer back down to a lower difficulty on the fly. I imagine in a game like Warframe, this might resemble not just damage attenuation, but a sort of conservation of ninjutsu, where a single enemy scaled to your OP build is more engaging than 10 dozen fodder. Ah yes, conservation of ninjutsu. This idea is that if there are more enemies, it's almost implied that they're weaker, basically, in fiction in general. Often a comic book or campy movie trope, that, you know, being outnumbered implies that the hero will be able to dispatch all these goons with ease. Or there's something somehow disadvantageous about outnumbering the heroes or the player, even though you'd think it would be sort of the opposite. Anyway, yes, I do think that type of dynamic difficulty scaling is really interesting, although the present danger is that the player may game the system. There have even been games, there's a Resident Evil game that comes to mind, that dynamically scale the difficulty but don't make the player aware of that system. The idea being, again, that it might get a bit gamey if they did. I think these are interesting because in theory it's a really good idea, letting the game adapt to the player's skill, but in practice it's almost impossible that the player wouldn't find out, in the modern day anyway. It would become widely known that the game did this if it was a feature in a game in today's current media climate about video games. So unless the player simply doesn't read anything about a game before playing it, which is common, more common than people think sometimes, but certainly not overwhelmingly common. Lots of people read things about games. The player will likely adapt to the fact that the difficulty is being ramped up and down in some way. Oftentimes you see in some AI systems that the AI is sort of reacting, assuming the player will do a relatively good predicted thing, but then if the player doesn't, if they act much more or much less advanced than the AI has in mind, the AI acts very stupid and doesn't really know what to do. So I do think this is extremely tricky. To be honest, I also don't like this suggestion because it involves a lot of development time, potentially. I feel like there are some methods of balancing games that are really interesting that you mentioned in this parlay, that are, one great thing about them is they're not very difficult to implement in theory. They're just a number that you can change on a thing in the game, like the characters in FGO example. You can maybe have trouble balancing it, sure, but actually putting it in the game would be very easy. And so as a sort of balance doctor, I would prescribe that type of solution a little more readily, because it is has a very low cost to try. You still have to balance it. Anyway, I do think that's very interesting. It's a big topic, like how to deal with the player being aware of that. So again, I'll see a lot of these. You could go for a whole parlay on like each of these examples. So I'm talking as I go because I'm interested in them, but we'll get to the end and then I'll give some thoughts. Lately, Densoro says, I've been a big supporter of so-called assist modes, popularized by precision platformers Celeste and the like. These are granular difficulty options that allow you to buildcraft your difficulty by adjusting game speed, number of air dashes, checkpoints, etc. Under the right circumstances, this can go hand in hand with character buildcraft. A very simple example would be Hades. You could view the Mirror of Night as you building your own power level, and then the Pact of Punishment as you making a build for the Run's power level, for the Underworld's power level. That there's a lovely mirroring of the two. I almost wish they were the same upgrade. I like the idea of you going to the other side of the mirror, and that's the difficulty of everybody else or something. Very interesting. And in Hades, the way it works is that you get better rewards if you increase the heat, which is basically the overall power level of the run of the Underworld. If you make the Underworld overall more threatening, then you can get better rewards as you go, which is an interesting way to do it. Again, there's a lot of ways to fiddle with each of these. And I think that rewards tie quite heavily into balance like this, because if there is some reward for completing the game when the difficulty dynamically scales up to your character, for example, players could know about the increased difficulty scaling and yet still allow it to happen because they know there's a reward for you know, defeating the game at that level. That's potentially a solution. So, but then there's the whole other problem of rewarding the player for it. Anyway, we'll keep going. And by right circumstances, Densoro means the isometric hack-and-slash Luca born of a dream. The game features 2 global difficulty sliders affecting player durability and enemy durability. I played the game with both factions set as fragile as possible for quick, brutal fights. That's cool. That's like you can adjust the settings of the game's feeling of combat. That's interesting. The time to kill itself. The assist mode expands on this with, among other things, a toggle for infinite consumable items. This can be used to chug potions and brute force fights, which is not a bad thing, but I was intrigued by the rewind item, which lets you reset the room's combat encounter to the stats you had when you walked in. I don't know enough about this game for that to make sense. This had me constantly asking, can I save this run, or should I throw out all my progress so far and try again? And with the mutually low health values, I had to decide within a very narrow margin. Oh, okay, I see. So if you've made it so-and-so lethal and maybe your build on that run is coming along, you would have to decide very quickly, because combat is so lethal, should I rewind and try again, or can I keep going and make it? And so it's sort of a game of chicken, if I'm understanding correctly. Again, I don't know anything about this game, and there's way too many examples in this parlay for me to look them up. But that's what it sounds like. That's a cool idea. Having it be that the player, can just reset, sure, but you have to decide very much on the spot. That's a very interesting idea. This wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey backbone paired well with the game's surreal apocalyptic flavor, as if the flow of time in the universe was coming undone. That's interesting, yeah, if there's some atmospheric implication to that too. Going back to Tahitsu's original question, they mentioned how the parameters of each stat can break the difficulty curve, if you understood correctly. That was a bit of my understanding. If it's not too much of a sidebar, Densoro says, I've been wondering if RPG-style stat increases, especially with damage per second implications, are inherently harder to balance, and especially if games purely based on movement have an inherent balance. I don't think this is a sidebar. I feel like this is a related sort of vector to balance games in ways other than just pumping up their stats, basically. The original example you referenced that I used from Fate Grand Order, having the cost for a higher power character, is, opening the door to what you've been giving examples of, which are basically just other ways to do balance besides the game is a set amount of difficult and you can, make your character more powerful or whatever. So I think this is quite related. Densoro says about this movement being inherently balanced thing. An option can become overtuned if it does disproportionate damage or has a special mechanic, like invincibility frames that last too long or are too repeatable. And there's lots of other examples of such things. In the least derogatory way, Densoro says, how much of these spices to throw on an ability seems arbitrary, albeit informed. I don't always feel like it's that informed. It's not like it's impossible to balance those things, but it's true that burst damage and being strictly invulnerable are heavy-handed knobs for game balance. That's definitely true. And so conversely, Densoro wonders if sports ball games balance themselves by the simple fact, wherever the ball is, that's 99% of places where it's not. The goalie either did or did not block the soccer ball. A dodgeball thrown at the head has given up being thrown at the torso. This line of thinking is true of things like swords as well, which gives an inroad to balance in combat video games. It seems the inherent flavor of sword fighting is informed by the fact that there's no invincibility frames, no animation canceling, no binary block that covers all angles. This encourages flowing between all your options, as each one situationally becomes useful, and I wonder if this situationality is lost when games skip over these nuances. Is this an accurate assessment, and if so, can situationality be preserved by only increasing maneuvering stats? Just as a soccer player may run faster or kick the ball at a higher velocity, the damage inflicted by a goal stays the same. I like that metaphor. A very long parlay intro, but I think it's full of great examples. So, this is the balance, right? This is about 30 minutes. If you want to fill it with fantastic examples and guidance for the discussion, that's totally fine. I'll go on about my own thoughts for this latter half. Yeah, I think the idea of movement being an interesting way to balance is definitely something. There's a bit of a trope in I guess fantasy in general, often in maybe some wish fulfillment-y fantasy types of stories, where usually the enemies are very strong and the heroes are very fast. It's very common for the protagonist to be given an ability that is based on speed rather than power for a lot of reasons. One of them is that power often means being bulky and ripped or just big, which can seem evil, maybe evokes a sort of David and Goliath, I'm the underdog that is coming to defeat the big bad feeling. It can look pretty badass when somebody jukes around many fatal attacks by using speed. They'll die if they get hit even one time while they chip away at the enemy. That is a very heroic seeming trope. And so in a lot of fiction and fantasy, you'll find that the protagonist will gain an ability that is primarily about speed. As a final detail, being really fast often doesn't give you the ability to literally murder people really easily, whereas being strong generally does, or it's generally depicted that way, which allows our hero to have something powerful that can go toe-to-toe with an aggressive character, while still being able to attack people without hurting them. Their sort of default is they wouldn't kill somebody by attacking them. If you make them punch really fast instead of really hard, they can punch someone and not, murder them outright. This is all over the place in as recent a place as Cyberpunk Edgerunners, for example. The Sandevistan is a very clever way to allow David to be a total badass and do cool stuff and feel like a contender without giving him an ability that turns people into blood and guts. Anyway, at least that's the setup the story provides, to avoid spoilers. Where I'm going with this, I guess, is that I've always thought of speed as an inherently overpowered ability. In many games, this feels true. Warframe, for example, allows you most of the game's movement capabilities in PvP, which makes it extremely difficult to hit other players if you don't have a lot of practice with shooters, because they have the ability to basically fly or ping-pong themselves off of any given surface. The player just has a lot of freedom. Being in an open area, they still have incredible mobility and speed that most games don't afford you. So normal shooter balance doesn't really work the same way when the player can, again, basically fly, pretty much change trajectory in midair, and etc. There's not a lot of predicting or leading your shot that can be as practical. And indeed, Warframe does have a lot of hit scan weapons, which do not technically travel. When you pull the trigger, they show a little bullet firing, but you actually hit immediately on what's on the cursor when you fire, called a sort of hit scan weapon because your cursor scans for a hit. And if it's over an enemy, you get a hit. There is no travel time, even if the game tries to trick you into there being travel time. Warframe has a lot of weapons that are hit scan, and a lot that aren't. But that's definitely appropriate for a game where you have this amount of movement ability. I would argue in PvP in Warframe, yeah, I'm not trying to say it's bad if the weapon isn't hit scan, but it would be nice to have one when people can move at that speed. And even then, it can be quite hard to hit them. So I'm saying this because I think there's another side to this idea where movement is inherently overpowered, where it's very overpowered inherently to be fast. But I like the idea that increasing different maneuvering stats would be a way to give the player a lot of control over their character without allowing them to just do more damage. And in a way, I also think this is a lot more immersive. Like, there are a lot of great side effects to that approach. So let's imagine an example game where you would do this, because I think this idea is really interesting. We're making a normal stat-based kind of RPG-style game where you've got strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, let's say. But we are going to balance the game using every method other than making those stats go up. Your character is going to start by having a spread of those stats, which are their physical capabilities. They will not get stronger by increasing those things. They'll get stronger, or the game will get harder or easier, any other way except us increasing those stats. Again, to me, this sort of theme overall of this parlay is you've given a lot of good examples of how you can do that, a lot of which I find very compelling. Like, that sounds very cool. So A couple of them are things to increase the player's power, which if it can feel fun, like you want to feel like you're advancing your character and getting new abilities. That's something a lot of people enjoy, so there's no need to throw it out. But let's have it be things more like speed, for example. How far you can move in a turn, or how quickly you can switch between different weapons, or how far you can throw a projectile weapon or something like that. Maybe how quickly you can recover after getting hit or something like that. Again, I don't know what the gameplay of this game is, but maybe it's live action combat. So there's hit stun. That is when you get hit, you stagger and can't just immediately keep doing what you were doing, but maybe you can reduce that or stuff like that. So none of this increases your ability to slash somebody with a sword, because it kind of never made sense for that to be a thing you could increase anyway. You might have an amount of slashiness your character is capable of, but, you know, for example, let's say me, Zandy, if I was given a gladius right now, a Roman short sword, I would have a certain amount of, you know, damage I could inflict with it. Obviously, if I trained, I could increase that amount of damage, but it's a short sword. Like, I cannot cut down God using this weapon. And so in my mind, it might feel more intuitive to give the player the ability to use that very same stab or slash that they get at the beginning of the game, but just with such greater finesse that they're able to defeat stronger opponents. Even something like just attack speed feels like an interesting iteration here. Again, there could be a way to balance this where you put them on sort of a mirror, a lot like Hades' Mirror of Night. You can only increase attack speed by giving up the ability to increase the speed at which you recover from hit stun. So this means that if I'm not getting attacked, I can attack faster. But if I do get hit, I'm attacking slower than if I didn't attack faster, but I can keep attacking again sooner after I get hit. And trading those things off means you basically have different forms of attack speed, but you can fiddle them to your liking or to your playstyle. So that's one way. And then something like maybe the cooldown of a dodge roll that doesn't make you totally invulnerable versus just your movement speed. So you can manually avoid stuff, or you can lean on your dodge button, but you won't be able to dodge at all times. So you can choose to try to manually zoom around attacks, or you can choose to get the ability to dodge roll away from an attack more frequently, but not all of the time. Something like that. So you see what I mean, where it gives the player the ability to choose what type of evasion or attack speed style they want without making them directly more powerful. And in fact, all of these benefits are theoretically completely useless unless the player utilizes them. This is a type of build making or build system that would lead to player skill being significantly more important. I often think there's a very interesting balance between player skill and a build system. Many games have it that these are kind of both ways to the same goal. In a game like Hollow Knight, for example, you can fight a boss and beat them by just being good, or if you're not able to beat them, whether that's reasonable or not, there's no standard for skill among humans necessarily. There's an average, but we don't know what it is. Then you can go off into the world, get something to make you more powerful, and come back and then kill the boss with some advantage. So making a build or fleshing out your build more is basically, you know, potato with being good at the game. Like, they're just kind of together. Your success would always be a combination of both, and how you mix those ingredients is sort of up to you, giving a very open-ended game like Hollow Knight a lot of flexibility. If the player is having trouble, they have the ability to take it into their hands and get stronger very organically, and then come back and do it later. As long as the player becomes aware that they have the freedom to go wherever they like, they start feeling like they can just organically come back to a challenge when they're ready. They don't have to be told there is a system by which they can adjust the difficulty. They just kind of do it. So I do also think open-endedness is another beneficial approach. Even just giving the player more approaches, because people have different styles as players or things they're good at, giving the player more different ways to tackle something, none of which are explicitly easier, but just more options, will usually make something functionally easier for most players, because they'll unlock an option that they are superior at using for that different fight. So I do also think that simply providing the player a lot of side grades is another way to make the player no more powerful, but still create a sense of progression. But to go back more to probably what's really interesting to me, which is putting build systems in the hands of the enemies, possibly by tying them to this movement capability thing. The artificial intelligence of the enemies may want to react to whatever the player increases about their mobility stats. So you remember before how I said you'd maybe have these trade-offs where you can get more attack speed, maybe, or you can recover from hit stun quicker. Again, it's just an example. These would all depend very carefully on animation balance. Let's not worry about that for now, but you get the idea, you get the concept. Now, the enemies could get more powerful depending on which of those you picked. So, for example, perhaps enemies will interrupt your combos, if you have combos in this game, more often if you pick the attack speed, which means you have to have careful timing and watch the enemy's attack pattern to avoid getting hit stunned out of your combo, even though you can execute it quicker, to make it so that part of the game doesn't become trivially easy. And then if you don't like that form of difficulty scaling, you can remove it by just getting more hit stun resistance instead. But if you do that, the game will make hits do more damage, so you're more rewarded for dodging them, even though you get stunned less. You can keep attacking if you do get hit. Again, it's important to be careful here. You might give a challenging perk to the enemies along with a perk to the player that makes the player turned off to that perk that they could get. So it's important to be careful there. There's definitely cases where I feel like scaling one thing about the enemies is so catastrophic that no benefit would make me agree to do that. I've played games like that before, and that's just my preference. I'm just saying that maybe more players would try it if you're quite careful about making it feel like the player isn't giving up their strength inherently by increasing some difficulty slider. It just makes the ceiling of their performance higher, sure, but the player might just be unexcited about that benefit if the enemies are going to get souped up too. Perhaps you don't tell the player, for one thing, but again, they'll find out if they're looking for it. So the question becomes, well, what do you do? And I don't know, but again, it's interesting to consider how scaling the enemy difficulty may be a sort of last resort. I do like the idea that if a game has a sort of set challenge that adapts to the player in some way but doesn't get harder as they get more powerful, you can definitely play around a lot with the player's balance. If you combine a lot of these systems, like charging the player a cost for certain powerful upgrades, not increasing their power by increasing their direct damage or their stats, but simply by increasing their mobility utility, essentially. Even if that becomes a stat, the point is it's not their raw damage or whatever. When they do land a hit, that's still the same. You could then possibly create some kind of challenge that is a closed loop. What comes to mind for me is in games like Warframe, where a lot of the time you want to kill enemies faster because more will spawn, and then you can kill more enemies. You kind of don't need to make the difficulty adapt to the player exactly. It's just if they get done with what you put on their plate faster, the game has a sort of set pace at which it puts out more enemies, and you can kill them faster, get more enemies. You're never going to get more than this many enemies or whatever. You're not going to get harder enemies, but you will get those same enemies again quicker, I guess. The game doesn't have a set pace, it puts out enemies. But you get the point. It's not that the enemies are harder, that the challenge is harder, really. It just happens more if you are ready for it, which is, again, a sort of automatic balancing that keeps the pace of the game alive, I guess. Which seems like a good way to create... you see how that's kind of adaptive difficulty without literally making the enemies harder to kill when the player is more powerful? So I like that idea. I've always thought, as a closing note, that every game I play, I feel like there's some obvious flaw, and I wonder, so much of this game was so good, but then this part just seems like such an obvious outlier. And of course I've realized over the years that a lot of those things are just things I don't like. It doesn't really have anything to do with them being objectively bad. I just happen to not like those things as much. That being said, a lot of the time, I wonder if maybe there are these things like what you suggest, Densoro, these better compromises. Not every game should abandon statistical balancing and do this mobility utility thing we're talking about. Not every game is going to be able to do this. More powerful upgrades cost more, and so there's a capacity cost limit, like that whole thing. But they may be a better compromise in more games. You know, there are still very good pieces of design. It doesn't mean it's the objectively perfect piece of design for the single arbitrary ideal of a video game that is balanced beautifully. You know, I definitely used to think of games that way, and that doesn't really make sense. There are some types of mechanics in games that you may simply not be able to employ that method of balancing without making the game complicated in a way that compromises the fantasy of that type of gameplay. That being said, I do feel like if you wanted to make a game from the ground up that was had really rich build options, but was eminently balanced, I definitely think that thinking about this type of thing is useful. Thinking about how there may be something inherently more balanceable about movement rather than increasing the character's power or damage level. Again, you can say that being really fast is just overpowered, but there are different ways to be speedy, of course. And if the player's power, if the strength of a punch is set, then fiddling around with what type of mobility utility the player has is an interesting idea. Like, that's cool. So yeah, I think that's most of what I have to say, but that idea is very interesting to me. The idea that the player could possibly just use a different, again, it's not even a different playstyle, but like a different mechanic of moving around the game, sort of change the primary gameplay loop, the way they interact with enemies, to create a situation where they are getting the fantasy they want out of their character. You can still hit more rapidly for a bunch of little hits, or once for maybe a larger hit. It's just that you didn't get those little faster hits or that one big damaging hit from your build. You gained the ability to use that hit from your build. Do you want to build your body? Do you want your body to be ready to utilize the heavy charge attack or rapid quick attacks? You have both either way. It's just that if you build this way, maybe the heavy attack just isn't that useful. It does no more or less damage, it just maybe isn't more useful to you. And again, if it was just those two options, that would be boring. But give the player a kind of static kit and then let them fiddle with that stuff, and organically different options would become more or less viable lines of attack, maybe even against different types of enemies, which I think that sounds really cool. That could be very fun. That's about all I have to say. Yeah, I think this is a cool, really interesting topic. The idea that there may be a sort of starter kit for good balance, and then we could play around with, if I had double the time of Parley for this topic, I would now start talking about what kind of game would you want to fit this balance to, you know? So if we say, yeah, there's no perfect balance, but these things are maybe more balanceable, setting a cost for more powerful components rather than trying to make them of a similar power level, and balancing the player's mobility or utility, or you could say ergonomics maybe, or quality of life stuff, rather than the exact damage that things are doing or their capabilities, what they're capable of, just how they do it rather than what they can do. Okay, so those elements, what game or what type of gameplay loop would it be interesting to put that stuff in? And what types of gameplay loops maybe is that hard? So yeah, cool. That's all I have to say. I keep saying that, but I do have more to say, of course. A really interesting parlay.